Israel's wartime cabinet had only 5 people. True to the name, wartime, their total time serving in the military is more than a century. Up to now, the activities of Israel's wartime cabinet have been evaluated relatively positively. Experts assess that the cabinet has high trust from Israeli public opinion, according to the New York Times. In addition, the diverse composition also helps this agency easier to speak in foreign affairs, giving the Israeli army more time to conduct the campaign in Gaza despite the concerns of the international community. However, diversity can also be a double-edged sword. While cabinet members will often try to appear united in public, they cannot hide any signs of division. No one, in the cabinet, really trusts Mr. Netanyahu. That is the main problem of this cabinet, Mr. Yossi Meckelberg, an expert on the Middle East and North Africa at the Chatham Institute, UK, told Al Jazeera recently. End of October. Signs of disagreement. On December 2, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu entered the press conference room without the participation of Defense Minister Yoav Gallant as usual. Instead of holding a joint press conference with the Prime Minister, Mr. Gallant held a separate press conference. The two events were only a few minutes apart, according to Times of Israel. "I suggest holding a joint press conference with the defense minister tonight. He made his decision," Mr. Netanyahu said when asked about this issue. However, he also affirmed that the Israeli leadership is cooperating to achieve the goals of the war. Even when they appear together in front of the press, they don't always create a feeling of unity. In mid-November, Israeli social networks widely shared an image of Mr. Netanyahu standing alone in a corner, while Mr. Gallant and Mr. Benny Gantz, the third official member of the cabinet, stood together. Experts assess that one of the issues of disagreement in the Israeli cabinet is the governance model for the Gaza Strip after the war ends. There are two completely different views, former Israeli Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni said. She pointed out that Mr. Gantz and his allies did not rule out the prospect, supported by the U.S., of a peace process leading to the establishment of a peace process. On the contrary, Mr. Netanyahu repeatedly spoke out against the prospect of the Palestinian Authority, PA, taking control of the Gaza Strip after the war. Responding to a press conference in Tel Aviv on December 14, without mentioning Mr. Netanyahu by name, Mr. Gantz implicitly criticized some Israeli leaders for causing internal conflicts and damaging relations with the U.S., Times of Israel reported. According to the New York Times, the list of differences also includes policy with Lebanon, the timing of the Gaza attack, as well as the temporary ceasefire agreement last month. Meanwhile, according to Israel's Maariv newspaper, one of the other causes of conflict is that Mr. Netanyahu does not want to share the glory with other members of the cabinet, including Mr. Gallant and Mr. Gantz, about his achievements. Bringing the first group of Israeli hostages home after the agreement with Hamas. Besides, despite war, politicians also need to consider their personal and party political goals. A recent survey by Israel's Channel 13 television channel shows that Mr. Gantz's opposition coalition is leading the ruling Likud party. In a hypothetical election, the opposition would win up to 37 seats out of a total of 120 seats. Israeli parliament. Meanwhile, the Likud party only won 18 seats. Mr. Netanyahu understands that he has lost the trust of the people. Therefore, he needs to bring moderate figures into the government. Mr. Ehud Yaari, resident expert in Israel of the Washington Institute on Near East Policy, U.S., said. Personal conflicts. In addition to Mr. Netanyahu, Mr. Gallant and Mr. Gantz, Israel's wartime cabinet also includes two non-voting observers, former chief of the Israeli Army General Staff Gadi Eisenkot, an ally of Mr. Gantz, and the Minister of War. Strategist Ron Dermer, Mr. Netanyahu's ally. Without Hamas's attack on Israeli territory on October 7, it is difficult to imagine that the 5 politicians mentioned above could form a government together. The conflict between Mr. Gantz and Mr. Netanyahu stemmed from a period of poor cooperation 2 years ago. Mr. Netanyahu then broke the power-sharing agreement, causing Mr. Gantz to lose the opportunity to become prime minister. Meanwhile, the two Likud party members in the war cabinet, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant, also had unhealthy rice and not sweet soup. In March, Mr. Netanyahu intended to fire Mr. Gallant after the head of the Israeli Defense Ministry warned that plans to reform the judicial system could have a negative impact on national security. However, under pressure from protesters, Mr. Netanyahu's intentions could not come true. However, observers generally still assess that Israel's wartime cabinet operates relatively effectively and professionally. The agency meets several times a week and regularly discusses with senior security officials.